was just another quiet afternoon at the diner. The kind of day where the hum of the ceiling fan and the clinking of coffee cups were the only sounds breaking the silence. But in a split second, everything changed. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked a woman, calm, confident, and carrying an air of quiet strength. She took a seat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and pulled out a book. Her name was Lisa, and she was waiting for her husband to join her. Little did she know, her peaceful afternoon was about to take a turn that would leave everyone in the diner holding their breath. Across the room, a police officer sat in his usual spot, his uniform crisp, his demeanor stern. Officer Daniels had a reputation in town. Some called him tough, others called him something far less flattering. He was the kind of cop who believed in law and order above all else, and he didn't mind making that clear to anyone who crossed his path. Today, though, his eyes lingered on Lisa a little too long. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, unbothered and self-assured. Maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, it didn't sit right with him. The tension started small, almost imperceptible. A comment here, a glare there, but then it escalated. Officer Daniels approached Lisa, his tone sharp and accusatory. "You mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. Lisa looked up, her expression calm but firm. "Having coffee," she replied simply. But Daniels wasn't satisfied. He started questioning her, his words dripping with suspicion and disdain. The other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do. Lisa, though, stayed composed. She'd dealt with this kind of behavior before, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't alone. Unbeknownst to Officer Daniels, Lisa's husband was on his way. And he wasn't just any man. He was the newly appointed chief of police, a man who had spent his career fighting for justice and equality. He'd seen the worst of what the system could do, and he'd made it his mission to change it. As he walked into the diner, he took in the scene with a single glance. His wife, calm but clearly uncomfortable, and Officer Daniels, looming over her with an air of authority that felt more like intimidation. The room seemed to hold its breath as the chief stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. But before he could say a word, Daniels turned to him, unaware of who he was. "This doesn't concern you," the officer snapped, his tone dismissive. The chief paused, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, I think it does," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with something dangerous. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm about to break. And then, just as the chief was about to reveal who he was, the diner door swung open again. Everyone turned, their eyes wide with anticipation. Who was it? What would happen next? The story was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The door creaked open, and all eyes turned toward the newcomer. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, wearing a delivery uniform and holding a stack of flyers. He looked around nervously, clearly unaware of the tension he'd just walked into. Sorry," he mumbled, holding up one of the flyers. "Pizza specials for the week." His voice trailed off as he noticed the icy stares directed his way. He quickly dropped the flyers on the counter and backed out of the diner, the bell jingling again as the door closed behind him. The interruption was brief, but it was enough to break the spell that had gripped the room. Officer Daniels turned his attention back to Lisa, his jaw tightening. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" he said, his voice low but sharp. Lisa met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I'm just sitting here, officer," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "I don't see how that's a crime." The other diners exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting in their seats, others pretending to focus on their meals. No one wanted to get involved, but it was clear they were all rooting for Lisa in their own quiet way. The chief, still standing a few feet away, watched the exchange with a mix of anger and disbelief. He knew this kind of behavior existed. He'd spent his entire career fighting against it, but seeing it directed at his wife was something else entirely. He took a step forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip. "Officer Daniels," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "Is there a problem here?" Daniels turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. The chief didn't flinch. "I'm the new chief of police," he said, his words landing like a thunderclap in the small diner. For a moment the room was silent. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed to fade into the background. Officer Daniels blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. "Chief?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The chief nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's right," he said, "and I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." The tension in the room was palpable, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, but the chief wasn't done yet. He turned to Lisa, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lisa nodded, though her eyes still held a flicker of anger. "I'm fine," she said, "but this isn't the first time something like this has happened." The chief's jaw tightened at her words, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned back to Daniels, his gaze hardening. "We'll be having a conversation about this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But not here. Not now." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the sound of a siren cut through the air. Everyone turned toward the window where a patrol car was pulling up outside. The door opened and another officer stepped out, his expression grim. He walked into the diner, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Daniels. "We've got a situation," he said, his voice urgent. "We need you back at the station now." Daniels hesitated, his eyes flicking between the chief and Lisa. For a moment it looked like he might say something, but then he thought better of it. He turned on his heel and walked out of the diner, the door slamming shut behind him. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension easing but not entirely dissipating. The chief watched him go, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Lisa stood up, her book tucked under her arm. "Let's go," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with emotion. The chief nodded, his hand resting on the small of her back as they walked toward the door. The other diners watched them go, their faces a mix of relief and curiosity. What had just happened? And what would happen next? The story was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. As they stepped outside, the chief glanced at Lisa. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Lisa nodded, but her eyes told a different story. "I'm tired of this," she said quietly. "Tired of being treated like I don't belong." The chief's heart ached at her words. He'd dedicated his life to fighting for justice. But moments like this reminded him how far they still had to go. They got into their car, the engine purring to life as they pulled away from the diner. The chief's mind was racing, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, frustration, and determination. He knew he had to do something, not just for Lisa, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. But what? And how? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more urgent than the last. Meanwhile, back at the diner, the other patrons were slowly returning to their meals, though the atmosphere was still heavy with tension. The young waitress behind the counter wiped down the countertop, her hands trembling slightly. She'd seen a lot in her time working at the diner, but nothing quite like this. She glanced at the flyers the delivery boy had left behind, her eyes lingering on the words, "Community meeting tonight." Maybe, just maybe, this was a sign. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the small town, the story was far from over. The chief and Lisa drove home, their minds filled with thoughts of what had happened and what was yet to come. Officer Daniels, meanwhile, sat in his patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He knew he'd crossed a line, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. And somewhere in the shadows, the wheels of change were beginning to turn. But for now, the tension remained, unresolved and simmering, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that hangs heavy with unspoken words. Lisa stared out the window, her mind replaying the scene at the diner over and over. She could still feel the weight of Officer Daniels's stare, the way his words had cut through her like a knife. It wasn't just about today. It was about every time she'd been made to feel small, every time she'd been made to feel like she didn't belong. She glanced at her husband, the chief, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set in a hard line. She knew he was angry, but she also knew he was thinking, calculating. He always had a plan, even when things seemed impossible. When they pulled into their driveway, the house felt different somehow, less like a sanctuary and more like a battleground. Lisa stepped inside, her shoulders tense, while the chief lingered by the door, his phone already in his hand. "I need to make a call," he said, his voice low. Lisa nodded, not asking questions. She knew better than to interrupt him when he was in work mode. Instead, she headed to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water and trying to steady her nerves, but the quiet of the house only made her thoughts louder. Meanwhile, the chief stepped outside, the cool evening air doing little to calm the fire burning inside him. He dialed a number, his voice sharp as he spoke to the person on the other end. "I want a full report on Officer Daniels," he said. "Everything, disciplinary records, complaints, anything you can find. And keep it quiet for now." He hung up, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that had allowed behavior like this to go unchecked for far too long. But taking on the system wasn't going to be easy, especially in a town where old habits died hard. Back at the police station, Officer Daniels sat in the break room, his coffee untouched in front of him. The call that had pulled him away from the diner had been a false alarm, and now he was left alone with his thoughts. He replayed the encounter in his mind, his stomach churning with a mix of anger and something else, something he didn't want to admit. Guilt? Fear? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the new chief of police wasn't someone to be underestimated. And now, he'd made an enemy of him. Across town, the young waitress from the diner sat at her kitchen table, the flyer for the community meeting in front of her. She'd never been one to get involved in town politics, but something about what had happened today had stirred something inside her. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a number. "Hey, it's me," she said when the person on the other end answered. "I think we should go to that meeting tonight. Something's not right in this town, and I think it's time we did something about it." As the evening wore on, the town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. At the community center, a small group of people began to gather for the meeting. Among them was the delivery boy who had interrupted the tension at the diner earlier. He sat in the back, his hands fidgeting nervously. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the look on Lisa's face that had stayed with him. Either way, he felt like he needed to be here. The meeting began, the room buzzing with quiet conversations. The speaker, a local activist named Marcus, stood at the front, his voice steady but passionate. "We've been quiet for too long," he said, "but silence doesn't protect us. It's time we stand up and demand change." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, but there was also an undercurrent of fear. Change wasn't easy, especially in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Back at the chief's house, Lisa sat on the couch, her phone in her hand. She scrolled through her contacts, her finger hovering over a name she hadn't called in years. It was her old college friend, a journalist who had made a name for herself covering stories of injustice. Lisa hesitated, then pressed call. "Hey, it's me," she said when her friend answered. "I think I have a story for you." As the night deepened, the threads of the story began to weave together, each person playing their part in a larger narrative. The chief sat at his desk, poring over files and reports, his determination growing with every page. Officer Daniels paced his living room, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The waitress and the delivery boy sat in the community center, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and hope. And Lisa, her voice steady but filled with emotion, began to tell her story to her journalist friend. The town was on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. But for now, The tension remained, unresolved, and simmering, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The story was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky threatening rain. The town felt different, charged like the air before a storm. Lisa woke early, her mind still racing from the night before. She'd spent hours on the phone with her journalist friend, recounting every detail of what had happened at the diner and the years of microaggressions and outright discrimination she'd faced. It wasn't easy to relive those moments, but she knew it was necessary. If her story could help shine a light on the bigger problem, then it was worth it. She glanced at her husband, still asleep beside her, his face tense even in rest. She knew he was carrying the weight of what was to come, and she wished she could ease that burden, even just a little. At the police station, the chief arrived early, his office already filled with files and reports. He'd spent the night digging into Officer Daniels' record, and what he'd found was troubling. There were complaints, several of them from people in the community, but they'd been brushed aside or buried. There were patterns of behavior that should have been addressed years ago, but no one had done anything about it. The chief clenched his fists, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He knew what he had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. Taking on a fellow officer, especially one with ties to the old guard in the department, was a risky move, but he couldn't let this slide. Not again. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car parked in an empty lot on the edge of town. He hadn't slept much, his mind replaying the confrontation at the diner and the chief's cold, commanding tone. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who kept the streets safe. But now, for the first time, he was questioning himself. Had he crossed a line, or was this just how things were supposed to be? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. At the diner, the young waitress, Emily, was setting up for the day. She moved slowly, her mind still on the community meeting the night before. The room had been filled with anger and frustration, but also hope. A fragile, tentative hope that things could change. She'd never been one to speak up, but something about Lisa's quiet strength had inspired her. She glanced at the clock, wondering if Lisa would come in today. She hoped she would. There was so much she wanted to say. So much she wanted to. By mid-morning, the rain had started. A steady drizzle that turned the streets slick and shiny. Lisa arrived at the diner, her coat pulled tight against the chill. She nodded to Emily as she took her usual seat at the counter, her book in hand. But today, she wasn't reading. Today, she was waiting. She knew the journalist's story would be published soon, and she wanted to be here, in the place where it had all started, when it happened. At the police station, the chief called a meeting with his senior officers. He stood at the front of the room, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "A problem that's been ignored for too long." He laid out what he'd found, his words sharp and unflinching. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Some of the officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. Others nodded, their faces set in hard lines. They knew what this meant. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Back at the diner, the bell above the door jingled, and Lisa looked up, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't her husband or Emily. It was Officer Daniels. He stood in the doorway, his uniform damp from the rain, his expression unreadable. The room seemed to hold its breath as he walked toward the counter, his eyes locked on Lisa. Emily froze, her hand tightening around the coffee pot. Lisa, though, stayed calm, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. "We need to talk," Daniels said, his voice low. Lisa nodded, her expression unreadable. "Okay," she said simply. The tension in the room was palpable, like a live wire sparking in the rain. Emily glanced at the other customers who were pretending not to notice but were clearly on edge. She wanted to say something, to do something, but she didn't know what. Outside, the rain picked up, pounding against the windows like a drumbeat. The chief's meeting had ended, and he was on his way to the diner, his mind racing. He'd gotten a call from one of his officers telling him Daniels had been seen heading that way. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he knew he needed to be there. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove, the wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. At the diner, Daniels sat down across from Lisa, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out in a rush. Lisa raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but skeptical. "For what?" she asked. Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening. "For yesterday," he said. "For a lot of things." Lisa studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. "Sorry isn't enough," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Before Daniels could respond, the door burst open and the chief walked in, his presence commanding attention. The room seemed to freeze, the tension reaching a breaking point. The chief's eyes locked on Daniels, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Daniels stood, his face pale but defiant. "I was just leaving," he said, his voice shaking slightly. But the chief stepped forward, blocking his path. "Not yet," he said. The room was silent, the only sound the pounding of the rain outside. Everyone was waiting, their hearts pounding, their breaths held. What would happen next? The story was reaching its peak, the tension unbearable, the stakes higher than ever. And in that moment, anything could happen. The diner was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the back. The chief stood between Officer Daniels and the door, his presence like a storm about to break. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the exit, but the chief didn't budge. "Sit down," the chief said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. Daniels hesitated, then slowly sank back into the booth, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Lisa watched silently, her expression unreadable, but her heart was racing. She could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating, like the air before a lightning strike. The chief slid into the booth across from Daniels, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "You've got a lot to answer for," he said, his voice low but sharp. Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but the chief cut him off. Not yet. You're going to listen." The other diners were frozen in place, their meals forgotten, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding in front of them. Emily, the waitress, stood behind the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge. She wanted to intervene, to do something, but she felt rooted to the spot. Before the chief could continue, the bell above the door jingled again, and all heads turned. A man in a suit walked in, his face grim, a folder tucked under his arm. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the chief. "Chief," he said, nodding curtly. "We need to talk. Now." The chief's brow furrowed, but he stood, his movements deliberate. "This isn't a good time," he said, his voice tight. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's about the mayor," he said, "and it can't wait." The chief's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He turned to Lisa, his expression softening for just a moment. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be back." Lisa nodded, though her stomach was in knots. She watched as the chief followed the man. Outside, the rain still pouring down in sheets. The diner seemed to exhale collectively, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it felt heavier, more oppressive. Daniels leaned back in the booth, his face pale but his eyes defiant. "You think this changes anything?" he said, his voice low but dripping with bitterness. Lisa turned to him, her gaze steady. "It already has," she said, "whether you see it or not." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "You don't get to talk to her like that," she said, her hands shaking but her eyes blazing. "Not here, not anymore." Daniels stared at her, his expression a mix of surprise and anger. "Stay out of this," he snapped. But Emily didn't back down. "No," she said. "You don't get to bully people and then act like you're the victim. We're done letting you get away with it." The other diners murmured in agreement, their voices low but firm. For the first time, Daniels looked uncertain, his confidence wavering. Outside, the chief stood under the diner's awning, the rain soaking the edges of his coat. The man in the suit handed him the folder, his expression grave. "The mayor's involved," he said. "He's been covering for Daniels for years. There's more, a lot more. But if you go after him, it's going to get ugly." The chief flipped through the folder, his jaw tightening with every page. "It's already ugly," he said, his voice hard. "But this ends now." Back inside, the diner was buzzing with quiet conversations, the tension still thick but now laced with a sense of defiance. Lisa stood, her book tucked under her arm, and walked toward the door. She paused, turning to Emily. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Emily nodded, her eyes shining. "We've got your back," she said. "All of us." As Lisa stepped outside, the chief was waiting for her, his expression unreadable but his eyes filled with determination. "It's bigger than we thought," he said, holding up the folder. "But we're not backing down." Lisa nodded, her heart pounding but her resolve steady. "I know," she said. "We're in this together." The rain continued to fall, the streets slick and shining under the dim streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, the sound cutting through the night like a warning. The story was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The town was on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. But for now, the tension remained, unresolved and simmering, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The rain was coming down harder now, drenching the streets and turning the town into a blur of gray and neon. The chief and Lisa stood under the diner's awning, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. Inside, the diner buzzed with a nervous energy, the patrons whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward the door. Officer Daniels still sat, in the booth, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He knew something was coming, something he couldn't stop, but he didn't know what. And that scared him more than anything. The chief turned to Lisa, his voice low but urgent. "I need to handle this," he said. "But I need you to stay safe. Go home, lock the doors. I'll call you as soon as I can." Lisa shook her head, her expression firm. "No," she said. "I'm not hiding anymore. This is my fight too." The chief hesitated, then nodded. He knew better than to argue with her when she had that look in her eyes. "Okay," he said, "but stay close." They climbed into the car, the rain pounding against the windshield as the chief drove toward the police station. His mind was racing, the contents of the folder burning in his thoughts. The mayor, Daniels, the years of cover-ups and corruption. It was all connected, a web of lies and power that had been hiding in plain sight. But now it was about to unravel. The station. The chief stormed in, Lisa right behind him. The officers on duty looked up, their expressions a mix of surprise and unease. The chief didn't waste time. "I need everyone in the briefing room now," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The officers scrambled to obey, their footsteps echoing down the hall. In the briefing room, the chief stood at the front, the folder in his hands. He looked around the room, his gaze steady but intense. "We have a problem," he said. "A big one. And it starts with Officer Daniels." He opened the folder, pulling out documents and photos, laying them out on the table for everyone to see. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy blanket. "This isn't just about one bad cop," the chief continued. "This is about a system that's been broken for years, a system that's protected people, like Daniels, while ignoring the voices of the people they're supposed to serve. But that ends today." He turned to one of the senior officers. "I want Daniels brought in, now." The officer nodded, his face grim, and left the room. As the chief continued to lay out his plan, Lisa stood in the corner, her heart pounding. She felt a mix of emotions, anger, relief, hope. But there was also fear of what would happen next, fear of how far this would go. She glanced at the chief, his face set in a hard line, and felt a surge of pride. He was doing the right thing no matter how hard it was, and she was going to stand by him no matter what. Meanwhile, Daniels sat in his patrol car parked in an empty lot on the edge of town. He'd left the diner in a hurry, his mind racing, his hands shaking on the wheel. He knew the chief was coming for him. He could feel it. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He reached for his phone, dialing a number with trembling fingers. "It's me," he said when the person on the other end answered. "I need your help. Now." Back at the station, the chief was wrapping up the briefing when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. It was a text from an unknown number. He opened it, his heart skipping a beat as he read the words. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." He showed the text to Lisa, his expression grim. "We need to move fast," he said. Just then the door burst open, and the senior officer rushed in, his face pale. "Chief, we've got a problem," he said. "Daniels is gone, and so is the mayor." The room erupted in chaos, the officers shouting questions, their voices overlapping. The chief held up a hand, silencing them. "Find them," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Now." As the officers scrambled to follow his orders, the chief turned to Lisa, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he said. "Not yet." Lisa nodded, her heart pounding but her resolve steady. "I know," she said. "But we're ready." The rain continued to fall, the streets slick and shining under the dim streetlights. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, the sound cutting through the night like a warning. The story was reaching its climax, the tension unbearable, the stakes higher than ever. And in that moment anything could happen. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time the chief and Lisa stepped out of the police station, the cool night air sharp against their faces. The town felt different now, quieter but charged with an undercurrent of anticipation. The hunt for Daniels and the mayor was underway, and every officer in the department was on high alert. The chief had called in reinforcements from neighboring precincts, and the streets were alive with the flashing lights of patrol cars and the low hum of radios. But despite the chaos, there was a sense of purpose, a feeling that something long overdue was finally happening. Lisa stood beside the chief, her arms wrapped around herself to ward off the chill. She glanced at him, his face illuminated by the glow of the streetlights. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The chief sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Now we wait," he said, "and we hope they make a mistake." He turned to her, his expression softening. "But no matter what happens, this is just the beginning. We've opened a door, and there's no closing it now." Back at the diner, Emily was locking up for the night, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the key in the lock. The events of the day had left her shaken but also strangely empowered. For the first time in her life, she felt like she'd stood up for something that mattered. She glanced at the flyer for the community meeting still taped to the window, the words, "Change starts here," standing out in bold letters. She smiled faintly, a spark of hope flickering in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. She turned to leave. A car pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The window rolled down and the delivery boy from earlier leaned out, his face pale but determined. "Hey," he said. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" Emily nodded, though her eyes were filled with emotion. "I'm fine," she said. "But I think we need to do more. This town, it's broken and we need to fix it." The delivery boy hesitated, then nodded. "I'm in," he said, "whatever it takes." Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, Daniels and the mayor sat in a dimly lit motel room, the air thick with tension. The mayor paced the room, his face flushed with anger. "This is a disaster," he snapped. "How could you let this happen?" Daniels glared at him, his hands clenched into fists. "You think this is my fault?" he shot back. "You're the one who's been covering for me all these years. You're just as guilty as I am." The mayor stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're in this together, whether you like it or not." But Daniels wasn't so sure. He'd always trusted the mayor, relied on him to keep things under control. But now, with the chief closing in and the town turning against them, he wasn't sure who he could trust. He glanced at the door, his mind racing. Maybe there was still a way out, maybe he could disappear, start over somewhere new. But deep down, he knew it was too late. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Back at the police station, the chief was reviewing the latest updates when his phone buzzed. It was a call from one of the officers on patrol. "We've got a lead," the officer said, his voice tense. "A motel on the edge of town. Someone, matching Daniel's description, checked in an hour ago." The chief's heart skipped a beat. "Send a team," he said. "But be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." Within minutes, the motel was surrounded, the flashing lights of patrol cars illuminating the night. The chief stood at the front, his hand resting on his holster, his eyes locked on the door of the room where Daniels and the mayor were believed to be hiding. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. "Daniels, Mayor, come out with your hands up. This is over." For a moment, there was silence. Then the door creaked open, and Daniels stepped out, his hands raised, his face pale but resigned. The mayor followed, his expression a mix of anger and fear. The officers moved in, cuffing them and leading them to separate patrol cars. The chief watched, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. It was over. Finally, it was over. As the cars pulled away, the chief turned to Lisa, who had been standing a few feet behind him, her eyes filled with emotion. "It's done," he said, his voice soft but filled with relief. Lisa nodded, though her mind was still racing. "What happens now?" she asked. The chief sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Now we rebuild," he said. "We make sure this never happens again." The next morning, the town woke to a new reality. The news of Daniels and the mayor's arrests had spread like wildfire, and the streets were buzzing with conversation. At the diner, Emily and the delivery boy sat at the counter, their heads bent together as they discussed plans for the next community meeting. The flyer on the window had been replaced with a new one. The words, "A New Beginning," written in bold letters. At the police station, the chief stood in front of a crowd of reporters, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is a new chapter for our town," he said. "A chapter where accountability and justice are more than just words. We've taken the first step, but there's still a lot of work to do, and we're ready to do it." Lisa stood at the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The town had been shaken to its core, but it was also waking up, coming together in a way she hadn't seen before. And she knew, no matter what happened next, they were in it together. As the sun rose over the town, casting a warm glow over the streets, the story came to a close. But it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning of change, of hope, of a future where justice wasn't just a dream, but a reality. And as the people of the town went about their day, they carried that hope with them, a quiet but powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, light could still break through.